No, I wasn't supposed to do that. I'm new at this. Now for the short pause. Yes. Welcome to Friday Forum. I'm Caitlin Baggett-Davis, a member of City Club's Board of Governors. For more than 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people have come together to find solutions to our region's biggest challenges. Today, we're a diverse network of people who are eager to learn, connect, and share ideas for a better Oregon. Thank you for joining us at the Sentinel Hotel in downtown Portland, where thousands of people are joining us online, on the radio, and on TV. Live viewers are watching on KGW's website, Facebook feed, and news app. Our radio audience is listening via X-Ray FM's stations, 107.1 FM and 91.1 FM. And TV viewers will watch today's program via Open Signal's community media television stations. We are incredibly grateful for the support of our media partners in bringing City Club forums to our community. In addition to City Club's valued media partners, our sponsors, volunteers, and staff enable us to put on Oregon's best civic programs week after week. Please join me in showing our appreciation to everyone who has made this event possible. If you followed the news coming out of Salem over the last couple of weeks, you've heard a lot about cap and trade, militias, threats to the Oregon State Police, and a Republican walkout. But the current walkout is the second this legislative session. The first walkout was over the Student Success Act, which intends to provide $2 billion in funding for K-12 schools over the next 2 years. That legislation, which nearly everyone in the education community agrees is critically important, leaves out higher education. Last February, Governor Kate Brown told our audience at the State of the State Friday Forum, "My base budget, the level that I invested in community colleges, was absolutely unacceptable, and that's why I'm committed to getting additional resources in." Those resources did not come in. So where does that leave post-secondary institutions in Oregon? Here to discuss how higher education was handled during the state budgeting processes are Mark Mitsui, the president of Portland Community College and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Community Colleges for the U.S. Department of Education. Also with us today is Ben Cannon, a former state legislator and the executive director of the Higher Education Coordinating Commission. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Well, thank you, Caitlin. Appreciate the welcome and the introduction. I'm looking forward to the conversation, first with Mark, and then with you in the Q&A. We'll handle this through several different topics that Mark and I will discuss, really focused on the legislative session, as Caitlin indicated, both what it accomplished, because there were some accomplishments for post-secondary education, but notably also where it fell short. I'm going to open and spend a moment just sort of grounding us in what we mean when we talk about Oregon higher education. First of all, Oregon's higher education system serves almost 400,000 students annually. And when we talk about those students and we talk about higher education, we're talking about students attending public universities, community colleges, private colleges and universities, trade schools, and other institutions that support learners beyond high school. They produce nearly 60,000 degrees and certificates annually, and they serve an enormous diversity of learners in the state of Oregon, over half of whom are over the age of 25, 38% of whom are first-generation students, 78% of whom attend school part-time. So I think it's important when we talk about Oregon higher education, not to use the model that I think many of us in this room and perhaps watching, many Oregon legislators, the model that they may have on their mind, which is a traditional 4-year degree-producing institution, but really the breadth and diversity of our colleges, universities, trade schools, and others in the state. We've seen in Oregon a remarkable increase in the diversity of students served by our institutions. And point out, for example, Portland State University, where for the first time ever, the majority of its incoming class in 2019 were students of color. 49% of their new students in 2019, students of color, 46% whom are white, increasing the populations of first-generation students of all ethnicities, increasing percentages of women. It is an extraordinarily diverse and flexible system of post-secondary education, and I think that's one of its strengths. So let's turn to the legislative session. And Caitlin noted, rightfully, the governor called for significantly greater levels of investments than were proposed in her initial budget for the legislature. The legislature did ultimately, and we expect in final passage at some point in the next several days, will ultimately provide for some additional resources over and above what the governor had proposed at the outset. But my perspective, the perspective of the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, is that overall this has been a disappointing session for post-secondary education that's failed to make meaningful progress against the state's goals and our economic and workforce needs. And I want to be really clear here, context matters. If we were in a recession, if we were facing significant state budget cuts, if we were experiencing significant job losses or revenue declines, we would have a different view of the outcomes of this session. But in the context of record economic growth, increased state revenues, major new investments for our pre-K-12 system, as well as the significant fiscal headwinds that are facing our colleges and other institutions, this is a short-sighted budget for post-secondary education in Oregon. The result of the legislature's budgets for our community colleges and public universities will be tuition increases, some in the range of 5 to 10%, will be budget cuts, some in the range of 2, 3, or 4%, will be the use of institutional reserves, spending down dollars that institutions have saved for a rainy day, as high as 12%. Not all of those actions, tuition increases, cuts, use of reserves, will occur at every public institution in Oregon or will occur in the same way. But at many, we will see those kinds of steps being taken because of the lack of state support, the fiscal headwinds that they face at the institutional level. And this comes on top of a decade of tuition increases. And let me just cite what that has meant for Oregon students. Since 2008, tuition up 60% for Oregonians at public universities, 68% for Oregonians at community colleges. And of course, tuition represents just a fraction of the total costs that students pay, increasing costs for room and board and books and transportation that add $14,000 to $16,000 a year for a typical student. And yes, grant aid exists, particularly for low-income students, the Pell Grant, the Oregon Opportunity Grant, but those programs have not been increasing and have not been keeping up with the need. And so for an Oregon student who comes from a low-income family, a family making less than $30,000 a year, even after taking into account the grant aid that they may qualify for via the Pell Grant, via the Oregon Opportunity Grant, they would require 80% of their household income, 80% of their household income to attend a college in this state, to attend a university in this state. So yes, the legislature made some progress, certainly over and above where we were in December, January. Yes, it is continuing to fund the Oregon Promise that provides access to community colleges for recent high school students at little or no tuition. It did fund modest increases to the Oregon Opportunity Grant. It funded modest increases to our community colleges and universities, but it did not make meaningful new investments or policies designed to systematically support increased access, affordability, transferability, equity, career and technical education at our community colleges and universities. And if budgets are an expression of priorities, the legislature has made it pretty clear this session that post-secondary education is not today a very high priority for lawmakers in the state of Oregon. And I want to be clear, it could have been worse, right? And I think as a silver lining, it creates a moment of clarity for our legislature, for our advocates, for the citizens and people of Oregon. To what extent do we care about keeping the public in public post-secondary education? To what extent should and will post-secondary education be a priority for this state going forward? We'll come back to that and some thoughts about opportunities and next steps in a few minutes, but for now, I want to turn it over to President Mitsui and ask him to address his thoughts on what the legislature's action or inaction in the 2019 session means for, in particular, Portland Community College.
Thank you, Ben. And if I could just briefly build on your comments about need. So if Maslow's hierarchy of needs was an iceberg, tuition would be above the waterline, housing, room and board, transportation, childcare, food, that would all be below the waterline. And that's what our students run into on a regular basis, is everything below that waterline. So tuition policy is important, and the reality for our students is they have to eat and they need a place to sleep while they're going to school. So there's been some recent research by Dr. Sarah Goldick-Rabb from Temple University's Hope Center, and she has had several national studies now of community college students. One of the studies she performed was several states worth of community colleges and over 30,000 students. She found that 13 to 14% of those students were homeless while they were pursuing their post-secondary credential at a community college. 44% experienced housing insecurity, and nearly 2/3 experienced food insecurity. Now, it's tough to pursue your degree when you're not sure where you're going to eat or where you're going to sleep. It also means that students have to work more and study less. You know, it's mathematically impossible to graduate on time if you're only taking 6 credits per quarter. This lines up with my own personal experience when I started teaching at Renton Technical College. I could look at a class of 30. Sure enough, this student's living in a tent, this student's living in a bus, this student is couch surfing. And unfortunately, it hasn't changed that much based on the research that we're currently seeing. So as we look at the need, it's really important for us to be cognizant of the housing and food insecurity, the child care needs of students or parents, as well as the other unmet financial needs that Ben referenced that our students need to address if they're going to be able to go to school and graduate. So at Portland Community College, we serve about 70,000 students annually. We have 4 campuses, 7 centers, and we are very proud of the fact that community is our middle name. And so when we take a look at the need, we want to think about the community context. And today, in the region that we serve, there's a new kind of crisis. And this crisis has to do with spiraling housing costs, gentrification, and displacement. And it's our students who tend to get displaced. It's communities of color, first-generation, low-income students that tend to be pushed farther and farther out of our service area. And so when we take a look at the need, because our average age is 28, 30 to 40% of our students are parents, and nationally, a disproportionate share of parents in the community colleges are parents of color, more specifically women of color, and childcare is a major barrier to completion. We want to highlight the importance of being able to serve the working poor in this state, those that are trying to make their lives better for themselves and their children, but struggle to be able to pay the bills while they do that. In this state, there are 442,000 adults over the age of 25 making less than $25 an hour, with less than an associate's degree, or who are unemployed, and 275,000 of them do not have a high school credential over the age of 25. As important as a high school credential is, how many folks here would say to your children, our children, and say, you're okay, you're going to be all right in this economy without a high school credential, right? This is the economy where, at minimum, 2/3 of all jobs by 2020 will require post-secondary education and training. So an adult attainment goal was established here recently, and maybe later on we can talk about that as an important goal for the state to consider in taking a look at how we're going to serve our adult population. So when I first came to Portland, one of the things I noticed here is that you all have a lot of bridges. And I have come to think of the community colleges, four-year institutions, as one of those bridges, helping to move students out of poverty and into the middle class and beyond through education and training. And I will say in this session that the funding got us part of the way over the bridge, increased the width of the bridge somewhat so that we have a little bit of breathing room. So for us, it means we won't have to raise tuition as much. And it means we might be able to kickstart a few initiatives in order to improve equitable student success and opportunity for our students. At the same time, the need is much bigger than the funding level that we received. So when we take a look at the number of employers that we work with, and by the way, we work with 1,600 employers at Portland Community College, they're banging on the door, they're knocking my door down saying, I need more welders. I need more airframe power plant mechanics and technicians. I need more diesel service techs. I need more software developers. I need more nurses. I need more medical assistant. You fill in the blank. We just don't have the funding to be able to provide the number of programs and seats in order to fill that need. And on the other side of the door, we have communities who would love those jobs. They just need the education and training to be able to access them. And so one of the pieces that was not funded in the session was a $70 million request that would have doubled the number of seats in our career technical education programs across the state to fill high-wage, high-demand skills gaps. The ask was very carefully calibrated with the use of data to show where those gaps were, how much students would make upon graduation, and what wage progression potential was, and what was needed to increase the number of seats. And unfortunately, it was not included in the revenue package, therefore it wasn't funded. The other part of the package that was not, the other part of the revenue package request that we had was for student success. 40% plus of our students are first generation, first in their families to enter higher education. Over 40% are Pell eligible. And we have some research now through our Future Connect evaluations that show what's working in terms of helping first-gen, low-income students of color to be successful. We've been able to double the graduation rate for this population group through our PCC Future Connect program. And we've been tracking the costs. We know what it costs. Based on that, we helped the state put together a request for $70 million across the state to help, that would help thousands of first-gen, predominantly students of color, access higher education and post-secondary education. That was not included in the revenue budget either. So to sum it up, where it has left us is we will not have to raise tuition as much as we were thinking. We might be able to keep it under 5%, and we'll be able to move some things forward. But that'll get us part of the way across the bridge, and we would love to get all the way across the bridge and help more students cross that bridge.
So let's talk about where that bridge leads to now. So looking forward, what is the type of future, what is the type of state that we imagine Oregon could be, and that we believe is achievable? And I'll share some thoughts on that, and then Mark, ask for yours. I think it's important to start first with an understanding of why, right? Why does this matter? And I know many in this room perhaps take for granted the importance and the impact of post-secondary education on the lives of individuals and communities, but let me put just a little bit more behind that. If you're a low-income student in Oregon who attends, a student from a low-income family, who attends college as a young adult, your earnings at the age of 34 are almost identical to the earnings of a student from an upper-income family who attends a similar type of school. Think about that for a moment. In that sense, attending college nearly erases the wealth effect, the advantage that we know students from upper income families gain in so many respects through education. That's the hopeful and inspirational side. The problem is that those low-income students, students from low-income families, are much less likely to attend college in the first place. And if they do, they're much less likely to enroll in it. They're much more likely to enroll in a non-selective institution. So we end up in post-secondary education. We have the seeds of transformation. We have the potential and the power for transformation. But we're also reinforcing economic inequality and divides through access. Only about a third of students from the bottom income quintile, the students from the lowest income, 20% in Oregon, enroll in a college or university as a young adult. About a third of students growing up in those low income families, compared with almost 90% from the top income quintile, from the top 20%. That's the barrier. The possibility is that when they do enroll and when they do succeed, that disadvantage associated with being from a low-income family is nearly erased. Oregon has adopted goals that reflect an aspirational vision for post-secondary education, that reflect an understanding of the opportunity for transformation that post-secondary education can provide. Our 40-40-20 goal, not talked about as much today as it was 5 or 8 years ago, but still in law, premised on the view that post-secondary education was increasingly a necessity for career, not only to meet existing job demands, but to help create the types of jobs and help create the type of state that we envision for the future. The adult education goal that the HEC recently adopted along with the Workforce Board at the direction of the legislature to express the number of additional Oregonians who will require a certificate or a degree or some form of post-secondary education and training by the year 2030. 300,000 additional Oregonians, adult Oregonians accessing and completing post-secondary education and training. And we know we have a ways to go, particularly in that middle 40, those certificates, those 2-year degrees, those career-oriented skills and trainings that are so beneficial to the individual and important for employers and for the community. Finally, we've adopted as a state an equity lens that says it's not enough for us to meet these goals as a state overall, but that we have to do so equitably. It commits us as a state to tackling educational disparities, particularly those that are the result of the injustice and discrimination experienced by the state's communities of color, and also the state's low-income, rural, and veteran populations. So these goals and visions, these official policy pronouncements of the legislature, of the HEC, of the Workforce Board, of the state of Oregon, and proclaimed by many legislators, reflect an understanding of the importance of post-secondary education for the workforce and for our communities. Mark touched on this, and just to reinforce, the amount of job growth post-recession that went to those who had post-secondary education training. 99% of the job growth in the years after the recession went to those with more than a high school education. And as we look forward, 61% of all new jobs will call for education and training beyond the high school between now and 2027. So the real question for Oregonians and Oregon leaders today is not sort of whether higher education is good. I think we agree that it is. But whether we are committed to it being a public good. The Student Success Act, and Caitlin touched on this in the introduction, it's expected to generate over $1 billion annually for Oregon public schools. And one of the key outcomes, one of the key desires of that act and intentions of that act is to increase our high school graduation rates. If everything goes as planned, we should see our high school graduates our high schools graduating more college and career-ready students over the course of the next 3 to 10 years. And I think this creates, an exciting opportunity and requirement for the state. If we're investing $1 billion annually of Oregonians' money into preparing more high schoolers for post-secondary education, I think it makes a lot of sense to make sure that our community colleges and our universities are equipped to provide high quality, high value, economically accessible degrees. The worst possible outcome would be if our investment in new intellectual capital, tomorrow's energetic and enterprising high school graduates, is exported to other states because they find in those other states lower cost, more accessible, more successful routes to certificates and degrees. And this is a real risk. As we look at our West Coast neighbors, the state of Washington this session passed a Workforce Investment Act that raises over $850 million new revenue to support free college tuition, not just at community colleges, but at any public college or university or apprenticeship program, with matching amounts for privates, for anyone, adults, young learners, from a family of less than, at 55% or less than the state's median income. That's up to about $50,000 for a family of 4. So if that's your family situation and you're a resident of the state of Washington, no matter how young or old you are, up to 4 years of tuition-free attendance at a public institution and a matching amount at a private institution in the state of Washington, with smaller grants available all the way up to median income, which is $92,000 for a family of 4 in the state of Washington. That is a state that has said, and a state legislature that has said that post-secondary education isn't just good, it's a public good. California making similarly historic investments with the Governor Gavin Newsom down there helping to drive down tuition and keep the doors of California colleges and universities open to Californians, attempting to keep their best and brightest at home. Our opportunity and our obligation in this state is to match our action to our rhetoric and to our goals to put the public into public post-secondary education through new levels of investment, new levels of coordination and accountability. Talk in a few minutes about potential paths to that, but in the meantime, let me turn to Mark for his thoughts.
Thanks, Ben. So to provide a PCC community college perspective on what that public good might look like, we could see a more equitable economic prosperity across the state. We would see communities of color represented in gains in median household income, which is not the case right now. If you take a look at some of our communities of color and gains in MHI across time during the recovery, you'll see significant disparities, which also unfortunately align with educational attainment and outcomes. So in other words, we would be able to rebuild and reimagine the middle class in the state of Oregon. And as we take a look now, the middle class is actually getting smaller, not only here in Oregon, but across the country. With that then comes increased prosperity, and it's intergenerational in terms, so we would begin to see a virtuous upward spiral. And we would see increased hope across all sectors and and parts of our society, I think. It really is a knowledge-based economy, and so we really have to increase educational attainment for all of Oregon's population. So when we take a look at the importance again of adults, and I just want to come back to that briefly, a lot of the students at Portland Community College are the parents of students in the K-12 system. And one of the most powerful predictors of a child's educational outcome is the educational attainment of the parent. So when that parent at PCC becomes a graduate, then their child is no longer the first in their family to attend or graduate from college. And that child is more likely to have access to health care, to a home, and to being able to have some stability. So I'd like to answer your question with a quick story. And this is about Dr. Tara Roberts. Tara was from Vernonia, and she was a single mom with 8 kids when she came to PCC. And she found encouraging and competent teachers and staff who believed in her before she believed in herself. She earned her associate's degree and then transferred to OHSU, where she earned her bachelor's, master's, and doctorate. Dr. Tara Roberts now works for Virginia Garcia, giving back to the community, and all 8 of her children have achieved post-secondary education and training. Some have pursued or are pursuing advanced degrees, and 3 work for Portland Community College as faculty. 2 generations at the same time. We believe that post-secondary education, particularly Portland Community College, is a twofer. That when you invest in us, you get 2 generations at the same time. That's what we could see with increased investment, right? The 442,000 adults across the state. As important as high school graduation is, it would take 9 graduating classes of 47,000 high school graduates a year to equal what's already here in terms of low-income adults across the state. So as we look at future investments and we think about the public good and we talk about equity, it's important to remember folks who may not currently be at the table and who are at risk of being left behind. And so I could see with that investment, we wouldn't be leaving folks behind, that we'd create that opportunity, that bridge out of poverty and into the middle class and beyond.
Thanks, Mark. For our radio audience, this is a reminder that this is the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Ben Cannon, Executive Director of the Higher Education Coordinating Commission. I'm here today with Mark Mitsui, President of Portland Community College. And we're going to turn to Q&A in just a few minutes. But first, for our sort of final section of the conversation that I'm having with President Mitsui, I wanted to talk about where do we go from here? How do we get from this legislative session with its modest investments, but disappointing, in my opinion, results, to the vision, the future that Mark and I have described as both ambitious but achievable for the state of Oregon. And there's no roadmap for this. There's no single template. There's certainly no single actor or organization that can bring that future state into being. But there are a lot of folks who care a great deal, who are, I believe, prepared to roll up their sleeves and build the type of partnership that can help our state decision makers ultimately conclude that the state's well-being depends on the type of investments and the type of policies that Mark has helped to describe for post-secondary education. I believe that over the next year or 2 years, that could be a process of engaging our boards of directors and trustees of public post-secondary institutions, their administrators, their faculty leaders, their students, the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, and legislators in developing a consensus, a shared vision for post-secondary education in Oregon, as well as a shared understanding of the type of budget implications that achieving that vision will have, the type of needs around transparency and accountability that a major new investment in public post-secondary education would require, as well as the types of ways in which we need to reimagine how we conduct and deliver post-secondary education in Oregon may be in order. New forms of partnership and delivery of post-secondary education. I think we need to help as a community of post-secondary leaders and participants. We need to help re-educate Oregon's leadership on the realities of post-secondary education today. Who's going to college, who's not? What those goals are and what they imply for our state. What the impacts are and what the barriers are. There's a surprising lack, I think, of clear understanding of what that system really looks like and who really participates in it. And I opened my comments trying to paint just through some of the data a little bit of that diversity of Oregon's post-secondary learners. And I think it's a point that's not clearly enough understood by, in particular, legislators today. So for the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, on its behalf, we look forward to working with the governor, with higher education leaders, with students, faculty, business leaders, and importantly, legislators to undertake this effort to build a shared consensus and a plan and platform going forward for this work. Mark, what do you think?
Well, count us in. We see this as an incredibly important step for elevating all Oregonians. From a community college perspective nationally, over 25% of all community colleges are now either eligible to be designated as or are designated as minority serving institutions, as open access institutions serving low-income communities, because unfortunately of the intersection between race and poverty in this country, community colleges are very diverse institutions because we have lower tuition rates as well. And also, we do provide a very diverse student transfer population to the universities in the state. So it's really important that both 2- and 4-year institutions are elevated together in terms of the opportunities that we can provide to students who heretofore really haven't had the same opportunity and chances historically as other groups. So from a community college perspective and from a PCC perspective, we think this could really change the landscape of opportunity for our students across the state. Again, particularly for students that used to be called non-traditional really are the new majority, right? So we just had commencement a couple weeks ago, and I asked, we had about 1,000 graduates there, the 5,000 who graduated, asked, how many are working? And everybody raises their hand. How many of you are taking care of kids while you're going to school? Half the audience. How many of you speak a language other than English at home? About half raised their hands. How many are veterans? Many raised their hands. This is the new majority in higher education. If you ask these same questions across the country at commencements, you would see the same pattern. What was true a generation ago about who's coming to college isn't true now. It's very, very different. And if we are going to continue to be a land of opportunity, where the window of opportunity is still open, and if we're going to be globally competitive, we have to invest in higher education. There's really no option. So as we take a look at the future and we take a look at future sessions, we'll be down in Salem as well, because we see it every day. Our students need that extra support, the navigation and the instruction together in a holistic package that helps all of our students to be successful.
Yeah, it strikes me that we're in a really interesting moment for this work as a state and likely as a country, where I think Oregonians generally understand and agree that a high school education alone is likely not enough to be highly successful, to earn a family wage job in the world that we have today. And yet we don't seem quite yet as a state prepared to say that for these adult students, there is a significant public responsibility, the way that we accept that public responsibility for kids within our K-12 system. When K-12 is, of course, a universal system, right? And there is an overwhelming sense of public responsibility for the funding and support of it. We are not at a universal post-secondary education system, but I think, again, many Oregonians recognize that it is nearly a universal requirement or an expectation. We're behind by a few years in terms of the sense of public responsibility for ensuring access, ensuring affordability, and ensuring success of those students, most of whom are adults, right? And I think that's a bit of the sort of political moment that we find ourselves in.
Could I briefly talk about student debt? And so as we take a look at student debt now exceeding credit card debt as a primary form of debt in this country, we as a country have shifted the burden of the cost of higher ed onto the students. Other countries get it, right? They invest in their higher education system, and that their debt level is much, much lower. That debt, of course, is an economic drag as well. And in addition to that, of course, is the value added of a post-secondary education. And we're starting to get data back from a group called MZ regarding what that investment brings back to the state, back to the student, back to the community. For every dollar students at PCC invest in their own education, they get a $3.73 return. For every dollar taxpayers invest, they get a $5.30 return, increased wage progression and income tax. For every public dollar that's invested in PCC, the general economy in our region gets a $12.50 return in reduced social costs and increased wages, and also in additional tax revenue. So I know it's not all about the economics, but if you're looking for a better return on investment than higher education, it's going to be hard to find. And so we are at a critical juncture where an investment in post-secondary education is not only the smart thing to do from an economic perspective, it's also the right thing to do from a perspective of equity.
Thanks, Mark. Let me remind here that for our radio audience, this is the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Ben Cannon, Executive Director of the Higher Education Coordinating Commission. I'm joined here today by Mark Mitsui, President of Portland Community College. And we are now going to go to the audience for some questions. Everyone watching or listening today is welcome to ask a question. If you've written a question on an index card, hold it high for City Club staff to collect. You may also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag FridayForum. To City Club members who would like to ask a question at the mic, please identify yourself as a member and ask one question in 30 seconds or less. Go.
Bill Dickey, City Club member. President Mitsui, this is a bit of a PCC success story. In 1995, I went to PCC and took Introduction to Printing. I was making a career change. And so 24 years later, I've sold $136 million worth of printing. All because PCC had the class Introduction to Printing, and I learned how to run a printing press, hang plates, cut paper, and I had to also identify a box of paper by the end of the semester. anyway, of individual sheets of paper, what they were, and so on and so forth. That class isn't offered anymore, which kind of disappoints me. And there's a lot of the trade schooling things that it would be really great if PCC was focused on. And so I guess I really don't have a question. I guess I'm more than willing to go testify at the legislature for the importance for why they should funnel money into PCC to support the community.
Thank you, Bill. So we do have, we are working on expanding our Swan Island Trade Center programs, and we're also working on doubling our apprenticeship programs in the trades in order to support. And we did have a CTE, Career Technical Education, request in the revenue package that would have doubled the number of career technical education programs in the community colleges across the state. So we welcome your support. Would love to talk with you afterwards. Thanks, Bill.
Wynn Wakala, City Club member. I grew up in a really small timber town down in southwestern Oregon, and the town has gone down like half in size because of the logging and whatnot, and the mill closing down. Do any of the community college have online programs that people can actually graduate? I mean, it's an hour and 15 minutes to the closest community college down there.
Several community colleges do. I'm most familiar with PCCs. About 40% of our students take online courses. And so the answer is yes, many community colleges do offer programs online. It does require a special set of skills that most community colleges support students with and train students with, in addition to training faculty to teach online. But yes, many are available.
John Calhoun, City Club. This is a follow-up to her question. I have a niece who just graduated with a degree. She started out at PCC. She's a first-generation college grad. Moved over to PSU. But she then finished off with an out-of-state online university because of cost and flexibility. I hear ads all the time for out-of-state degree programs. What are our public institutions doing to be competitive in this area, both for cost issues for the students, as well as keeping those dollars in state and helping your funding?
So President Mitsui's answer about the work that community colleges are doing to develop online options, I think, helps to illustrate the ways in which our public institutions, both 2-year and 4-year, are innovating new delivery methods in order to better serve Oregon students, including working adults, rural students, others who face barriers in attending a traditional college or university in the traditional way, on campus, full-time. I think there's a lot more to do in that vein. And I think we see colleges and universities responding to the market pressures, right? That student who left, it sounds like PSU, your niece who left PSU in order to complete at an out-of-state online institution was undoubtedly drawn to it because of the type of flexibility, the type of arrangements that it offered her. I think we will continue to see universities like PSU and community colleges like PCC themselves working to provide more innovative, more flexible ways of supporting students while maintaining the high levels of quality that their accrediting agencies and their faculty oversight and their boards of directors and trustees require. It's a hard balance, and the public institutions in particular, I think, face a pretty complex environment in terms of managing that. Yes, flexibility, yes, options, yes, new and more innovative programs, but on a limited dollar and while ensuring appropriate levels of rigor and quality. I think there's a certain role for the state and for the coordinating commission to play to help support that, to make sure that we're not a roadblock to innovation while continuing to ensure that students are receiving, valuable credits for valuable and rigorous work. That's a good question.
Rob Fulmer, City Club member. First, I wanted to say that I think that it's an excellent idea to have something analogous to the quality education model for K through 12 for higher ed. And I would love to see that place a premium on the student affordability and making sure that you're just not only delivering a quality product and knowing how much that costs, but also making sure that it continues or would, again, get back to affordability for students, because I don't think we can really say continuous at this point. We're no longer there. Now let me ask my question. So this is somewhat a little bit technical, and it's a question for Ben, but can you tell us what accounts for the difference between the 5.5% legislative University Support Fund current service level increase and the 16% current service level increase that the universities say that they need to continue the continuing services? Because this has been something that has confused me, and I think clarity would be great.
Thank you, Rob. I think it is. It's actually, I think, a really important question, although, as you noted, a somewhat technical one. Important in the sense that the lack of agreement between the legislature and our public institutions about what constitutes an appropriate or a continuing service level for level of state funding is that lack of agreement, I think, really has inhibited our ability to move forward with appropriate and significant levels of new state funding increases. The answers to your question, I think, are several. When the state attempts, its sort of budget writers attempt to crunch the numbers and discern what a continuing service level needs of the institutions are, they take into account only certain factors and not others. So they sort of limit their scope to recognized cost drivers at public institutions without looking at the entirety and the complexity of institutional budgets. There are phenomenon that some universities experience, including flat or even declining enrollments, for example, that put significant pressures on their budgets. If you're a tuition-based institution, as really all of our colleges and universities are for revenues, and you're not seeing increasing enrollment, but your costs are going up, then you've got a budget hole. And that, in turn, creates, in my view, an obligation for the state to help step up, right, to cover that, or appreciate that it will result in cuts at the institutional level. So that is one factor that can account for the difference between how our public universities, and the example you gave, and our budget writers understand the difference in the costs of current service level. The legislature or the legislature's budget writers have been pretty clear, and I think to some extent unfair in their sense of, look, you all are your own institute. You're not our problem. That's putting it probably too strongly. But you have your own boards, you're your own institutions. You figure it out. We'll give you the 5-6% increase. And if we do, our expectation is that you can make it work. The realities of institutional budgets are far more complicated. The dependence on tuition revenue and the kinds of limitations that institutions face in getting that tuition revenue is significant. I'll just give one other example because it's for a couple of institutions, including Portland State University and University of Oregon, is really significant. Under the current federal administration's policies and rhetoric, international students have been much less likely to come to the United States for higher education. That means for those Oregon public universities, declining amounts of revenue from international students, right? That puts a significant pressure on budgets. And again, it's not the type of factor that the state is accustomed to taking into account when it determines current service level. But if you're trying to balance the budget of a Portland State University or University of Oregon, and you're seeing multi-million-dollar declines in revenue from international students, you've got a big problem on your hands. Thanks for the question, Rob. We have a couple of questions on cards. I see someone else at the mic, and I know we're going to run short on time in 5 minutes. Let me read one question from the card and then get to the mic. The question is, and I'll turn this over to Mark. The state has underfunded higher education since Measure 5 cut taxes and Measure 11 grabbed a larger share of revenue. Is the fundamental answer to higher ed funding and reform, is the fundamental answer to higher ed funding reform to our justice system, schools over prisons?
That's a really important ratio that needs to be considered. Are we investing more in our prisons than we are in our colleges and universities? And of course, as you know, we take a look at Second Chance Pell, which is an experimental site through the Department of Education. The data coming out of that clearly shows that even when individuals go to prison, education is still the answer in terms of reducing recidivism. And so the investment certainly in higher education makes more sense as we take a look at dismantling the pipeline to prison. And so we need to take a look at certainly all aspects of the pipeline to prison. And starting at an early age, as well as looking at factors once individuals become adults.
Thanks. Back to the mic.
Kurt Wavering, member. My question has to do with faculty. Certainly as educators, you know that very good faculty creates good education. Can you talk about that subject for me?
Absolutely. So I started about 30 years ago as a teacher at Renton Technical College, and it is one of the most rewarding and critical positions in higher education. We are engaged in the enterprise of changing lives, and we are engaged in the enterprise of investing in human capital, and that takes people. We're in the people business, and it's a very important skill set. I think it's a complex skill set that our faculty need. You not only need the content expertise, you also need the teaching expertise, and you also need to know the systems in the college and within the campus. At the community college, teaching is particularly important because our students are commuter students, and they spend probably 90% of the time on campus in the classroom. And so how teachers are selected, how they're onboarded, how they are offered professional development opportunities, how that is all systematized, all of that is key and critical when we talk about equitable student success, equitable outcomes. So at PCC, at our Sylvania campus, that campus just completed an Excellence in Teaching initiative where faculty got together to talk about the art and craft of teaching, to exchange best practices, to encourage one another, to brainstorm on how to handle difficult situations. And we had a year of excellence in teaching, raising up and holding up and lifting up the art and craft of teaching. But it's vitally important, and I'm glad you raised that. As we talk about policy, which is very important, as we talk about funding, which also is very important, what happens between teachers and students that's where it comes down to in many respects. And also with our student affairs folks, anybody that deals directly with students. So thank you for raising that.
Our final question of the afternoon comes from the card and an audience member, and it is, what about the problem of student debt? And President Mitsui, you touched on this in your earlier comments and may have more to say as we conclude. Let me just note, I think there are really two questions here. So there's the problem of students who have incurred student debt and they're out in the workforce today, and that's particularly a problem for students, or for young adults who have been paying these high tuition and living costs over the last couple of decades, incurring a lot of debt, and it is inhibiting their ability to buy homes, start families, move, do the kinds of things necessary to live the type of life that their parents' generation perhaps was able to achieve. I think that is clearly a major topic, a major focus of many of the Democratic presidential candidates today, and I think we'll see continuing focus at a federal level on what may be possible from a policy standpoint to help recent college graduates address the debt that they've accumulated and that is creating really such a drag on the economy. I don't think there's such an obvious or significant state role to play in that regard, but it is clearly an important issue facing us. The other portion of student debt is going forward, and it has to do with the cost of attendance at Oregon public institutions for new and enrolling students, and that's where I think clearly the state investment, the state support, student success at those institutions is critically important to bringing down those costs, creating greater likelihoods of completion, and lowering that debt load or increasing the student's ability to repay it in the years to come. Anything to add?
No, I think you covered it. And so as we take a look at student success, that's really important. Default rates actually occur earlier in a student's journey, and so it's important that we have the funding to help students to be successful right off the bat, given all the unmet needs that students struggle with. And as we take a look at overall student debt, it's really important, as you pointed out, that state investment be there. In the public sector, the cost of tuition is directly related, of course, to the degree of public investment.
Ben
Thanks.
and Mark, thank you very much. Our time is up, and we'll have to pause the conversation for now. We're grateful to everyone who made today's forum possible. Thank you again to Ben and Mark for sharing your perspectives on funding for higher education in Oregon, and to all of you for joining us today. We are adjourned.